Good afternoon. My name is Stephanie Wood, and I am a gray seal biologist, and I am very excited to be joining the explore.org live Seal Island Gray Seal Cam page again. And I will be here for the next hour answering questions that people have about what you're seeing on this live cam. So feel free to go ahead and post questions. And it looks like some of the questions are coming in already. So again, what we're looking at here is Seal Island, which is an island in Outer Penobscot Bay in Maine. And what you're seeing is the pupping event that's in progress. And so you can see some moms with some pups and also some adult males on the island there. Excuse me. Seal Island is one of a handful of islands used by the gray seals to have their pups in the northeast U.S. It's the second largest, and we're several weeks into the into the pupping season at this point. And so the pupping season starts in about mid-December and will run through early February. And what we see happening are pregnant moms that come ashore to give birth to one pup, and then they nurse their pups for about 3 weeks. And then they wean the pups. The pups start to molt, which is why you see them with different types of fur patterns on them. And then the females will mate with the males that are there and go out to sea. So this whole event lasts for about 6 weeks, but all of the seals are never there at the same time. And so it's sort of spread out over this 6-week window. And I do see some questions are coming in here, so I'll start to answer them. One question is, how old are the pups that we are seeing? So that's a great question. We're seeing a range in ages. The youngest pups could be just days or hours old. The older pups could be several weeks old. And so what happens during this process is the moms give birth to the pups. They're pretty small and covered in white lanugo fur, which is that white furry fur that you see. They are nursed for about 2.5 to 3 weeks, and then they're abruptly weaned, and they start to lose that white fur. And so you can actually somewhat guesstimate how old a pup is by looking at its fur pattern. And so again, usually they start losing that white fur when they're about 3 weeks old. They'll stay on the island for another week or two, finishing up shedding that white fur. And what we'll see is their juvenile coat comes in underneath, and that's usually either a light gray or a dark gray. And then they'll head out to sea on their own. And so I know I've received a couple of questions about the molt and why they're born with this white fur, and it's probably a leftover. Gray seals are historically, and still in some parts of their range, actually have their pups on ice. And so having that white fur is a good color to have when you're born in a white environment. And so we see that the gray seals that are now using land to give birth still have that white fur. And it's left over from when they were all having their pups on the ice. Excuse me. So actually other seals have lanugo fur, things like harbor seals, which are not born on ice. They actually shed the lanugo fur in utero. And so we know that a harbor seal is a premature birth when it's born with the lanugo fur on it, because they're not supposed to be born with lanugo. They're supposed to shed that in utero and then be born with that juvenile coat coming in. Another question, how long can gray seals live for? That's another great question. Gray seals we know can live into their 40s, and actually the older that they get, the higher their survival rate is. And so first year survival is relatively low. We can see mortalities in the first year anywhere between 40 to 60% of the pups don't make it to their first birthday, depending on the population. And as they get older, juvenile survival is a little bit better. And by the time gray seals get to be about 5 or 6 years old, their survival rates, annual survival rates, are usually in the 90%. And so once they can reach adulthood, they end up being able to live for quite some time, again into their 30s, and there are some that are even 40. How many seals are out on the island? That's a great question I don't have an answer to. We usually collect information in terms of numbers on an island by flying aerial surveys, and a survey was flown last week over seal. And what we do with the aerial surveys is we fly over the island and we take a lot of pictures, and then we process those pictures back down on the ground. And so we don't have those numbers yet. The last time we were able to get a sense of numbers was in January of 2008, and we know that there were around 500 pups observed in a single day in aerial photos in 2008. So that is part of our ongoing research in terms of figuring out the status and what the population of gray seals in the northeast U.S. is doing, is conducting those aerial surveys and counts. Another question this morning. A large brown seal, a bull, seemed to be dominating a female in a small section of water. He didn't seem to be willing to let her climb out. Do you know why this might be? So again, once the moms have weaned their pups, they are ready to mate. So their mating cycle, their reproductive cycle is very succinct. And so the males that are on the island are there to reproduce, and males often can be very territorial, and to us it can look quite aggressive. And so I'm guessing that you were probably seeing a mating event this morning, what was described there. The next question, how many females will a male mate with during a season? Do they stick with the same female for a while, or will they just go from one to the next? That's another great question. And so gray seals have a different reproductive strategy than most humans do, and so the males don't tend to spend a lot of time with one female. What they do is they try to hold onto territories of females, groups of females, so that when the females are ready to mate, the male is able to mate with as many of them as possible. Sometimes what we see, depending on the gray seal site, you can see sort of really very strict territories where males are guarding large groups of females. Sometimes we see what we call mate guarding, and so you'll see a male sort of hanging out near a mom and pup, and probably she's getting ready to wean her pup and come into estrus and be ready to mate. And so males can kind of move from female to female, waiting for that process to happen. And so what we end up seeing is that the males that we see on the island probably end up mating with a fair number of females. Oftentimes what we see is that gray seal males, although they become reproductively mature, by the time they're about 5 or 6 years old, they may not actually enter the breeding population until they're closer to 10, when they can actually get on to some of these sites and be able to gain access to females. And so there's a lot of competition between males for access to females. And so what ends up happening is it's a little bit skewed, where we see a subset of males ending up fathering a predominant amount of females. Now, that's not to say that other males don't sort of sneak in there. There's been some genetic studies done in the UK that started looking at paternity on sites where they could follow 1 year to the next. They were watching mating events, and they had individually identifiable seals, and they could track and look and see how much the males that were on the island holding territories contributed to the next generation of pups. And what they found was that there were a certain number of males that they couldn't identify. So these are males that were perhaps waiting in the water to mate with females. So these are males that maybe aren't big enough or strong enough to hold a territory and fight with other males for access to females. And so they potentially sort of hang out right in the water and mate with females as they're leaving to go out to sea. And so there's a couple of different strategies that we see happening in terms of mating. Our next question, and just to follow up, so females also probably mate with more than one male as well. The next question is, do the young pups return to Seal Island, or do only breeding females arrive and males who want to mate? That's a great question. So during the breeding season, we would not expect to see 1-year-olds or juveniles on the breeding site. There's really not a lot of benefit for them to be there. As you may have seen, things can be kind of busy, the males can be quite aggressive, and so unless you're there to either have a pup or try to mate, you probably don't want to be on a breeding beach. Seals in general tend to return to where they're born to have their pups, so presumably a fair number of the pups that we're seeing born that survive to reproductive maturity, probably a fair amount of them will return to seal eventually, but we wouldn't expect to see pups or juveniles out there. Next question. This is another good question. I think I sort of answered, but I'll run through again. How old are gray seals when they are ready to mate? Is it different for males versus females? So in general, males and females can become reproductively mature between 3 and 5 years of age. But as I just mentioned, oftentimes males are not able to sort of hold a territory or hold their space on a breeding beach till they're a lot older, maybe closer to 10 years of age. The other interesting thing is that things like age at first reproduction, in particular for females, can be tied to what is happening in the overall population. If it's a population that's growing quickly and there's plenty of resources, we see that females can reproduce at an earlier age. As a population slows in its growth rate, we see that age of reproduction will become older. So you might see a population that's growing really quickly, and we see lots of 4-year-olds giving birth. As that population slows, that trend will change, and all of a sudden we'll start seeing that more females are having their first pup at, say, age 5. And so that's actually a really important population measure in terms of understanding what's happening with the population. We've seen a lot of eagles fight over the placenta after a baby is born, and moms seem to defend it. Well, the moms try to eat the placenta if they can. So eagles are definitely there looking for either the placentas. Remember that placentas for all mammals are very rich in nutrients, because that's what's been nourishing the fetus for that whole gestation period. So the birds definitely are fighting over the placenta. I think the mom tries to defend it more. She's just given birth, and the eagles are sort of coming in and probably just more defending the pup in the general area. To my knowledge, I don't think that the females eat the placentas, but that's something I can check on. But the placentas are definitely a great source of nutrients, and we know that a lot of birds are there to eat them. Will seals ever kill one another? It seems like the females defend their pups from the males as if they are a threat. Would a male ever eat a pup? So that's another great question. So we can think about, there's a lot of different interactions that are going on between the different seals that are out there. So we can see fighting between 2 male seals. Again, they like to hold territories, and they're fighting to gain access to females. We know from an evolutionary standpoint that there's this drive to have as many offspring as you can, and that's how we sort of measure things like fitness and success is by being able to leave behind as many offspring as possible. And so the males are willing to fight with each other. It's unlikely that they would fight to the death, because obviously you can't reproduce if you're dead. So they'll fight, they'll size each other up, and then usually they wouldn't want to get really hurt or injured, because it's better to at least be able to come back next year and try again than be killed in a fight. The moms will definitely defend the pups, and what you're seeing there is not so much probably the males being aggressive towards the pups or trying to eat the pups or anything like that, but the males, they're only interested in mating this year. They have no investment in the pups that are out there right now, because they have no idea whether they're their pups or not. And so they are just looking at, well, those are pups, I don't really care about them, I don't know if they're mine, they may or may not be, but what I do know is if I can mate with a female, she'll probably have my pup next year. And so obviously females are very different. They know which pup is theirs. They have a lot of investment in that pup, and so that's why you're seeing some of those different behaviors. How deep will gray seals dive? They can dive relatively deeply. I don't have those numbers right at my fingertips, but that's certainly something we can post on the Explore website. When the cam is on, is there always a person operating the camera? Great question. Yes, there's a great group of volunteer camera operators, and a partnership that Explore also has with a nonprofit organization called New Earth Life, and so there are always live people during the live hours operating the cameras, and they are spending a lot of time looking for different behaviors, looking for birth, looking for interactions, looking for interactions with birds, and they do a great job finding all of these different activities and events that are happening out there. will the females ever have twins, and could they raise twins successfully? So, excuse me, twins are quite rare for pinnipeds, which is the groups of seals and sea lions and walruses. They've been documented, sometimes in the wild, but they're very rare. The pups are quite costly to the moms energetically. So remember, when the moms come on shore and give birth, basically she stays with that pup for about 3 weeks, 2.5 to 3 weeks, and so she's not going in and fishing. And so what she's doing in terms of creating milk for the pups is she's actually converting all of her blubber into milk. And so it would be hard. Most moms would not have enough blubber to convert enough milk to successfully wean 2 pups. We know that, excuse me, gray seal milk is about 50% fat, and we know that the pups can gain about upwards close to 2 pounds a day, and so that's a lot of resources for a mom to invest into a pup. So it's unlikely that she'd be able to raise twins successfully. Another question about when they might first bear their young. So again, females might be 4, or they might be as old as 6 when they have their first pup. It depends on what's happening with the population trends and whether this is a population that's expanding quickly, or if it's a population that's sort of slowing down in its overall growth rate. When we see a slowdown in the overall growth rate, what we see is that the moms tend to be older when they have their first pups. This is another interesting question, which I wish I had the answer to. Why do I think this is such a popular breeding ground for seals? There are many islands along the coast of Maine to choose from. And there's been a lot of research and this is a question not just about where seals might have their pups, but just why seals choose certain tidal ledges or beaches to haul out on even when they're not reproducing. And we know that certain things seem to influence them, but we don't have a hard and fast rule as to why they pick certain sites. In general, what we see is they usually don't have their pups anywhere on the mainland, and this is probably from an evolutionary standpoint, they didn't want to give birth to pups where there might be any sort of land predators. So when you think back in time, thousands of years ago, when there were more bears or cats or things like that that might be a threat to the seals. We've also seen that they usually don't give birth to pups on islands that even have a lot of trees. And again, we think that is related to the predator concern. But otherwise, there's a lot of questions still as to how they pick the islands they use. Are gray seals friendly towards people? I mean, they're wild animals, so I wouldn't call them friendly towards people. Certainly, common sense and some of the regulations that exist, people should really give wild animals a lot of room. They should give seals quite a lot of space. If you happen upon a seal, you'd want to back away and not disturb them. Obviously, as someone mentioned in an earlier question, we see that females can be very protective of their pups, and so I wouldn't say that they are friendly towards people. They're really wild animals. They're large, mammals that are out on their own. They're not really friendly. How much time do gray seals spend hunting? That's another great question. And that probably changes day to day and season to season depending on what else is going on. So like I mentioned, the males and females that you're seeing right now on Seal Island, they're not hunting at all. They are staying on that island, and if they're a female, they're giving birth and nursing that pup, and if they're a male, they're trying to gain access to as many females as possible. And so they're not hunting at all. Now when they leave, the adults will have lost a fair amount of weight, so they're going to go out and spend a significant amount of time hunting and trying to replenish their stores and build up their blubber layer again. But that's a great question, and it really changes from season, and that's something that we need to do a lot more research on. The best way to get at questions like that is to use things like satellite tags that you can attach to the fur of an animal, and it can track things like length of time underwater, how deeply they dove, where the animal moved, and try and get a better sense of how much time they're feeding, and we don't know that. What is our next question? Has it been difficult for seals to find enough food? So again, we don't have a lot of details or specifics about what the gray seals in the Northeast U.S. are doing in terms of food habits. The population in general has been increasing, so I would say in a general sense, it's probably not been hard for them to find food. If it were, they probably wouldn't, the population probably wouldn't be increasing in the same way that it has been. Why is it that seals don't eat during the pupping season? Is it safer? So that's another good question. So there's probably a lot going on that has led to this particular scenario, a reproductive scenario. So if you're a mom, so remember that gray seals historically pupped on ice, and they pup on ice still in parts of their range. So if you go to the Gulf of St. Lawrence in Canada, or you go to parts of Northern Europe and the Baltic Sea, you'll see them pupping on ice. And sometimes ice can be a very unstable habitat, and so you want to kind of spend time with your pup. You don't want to leave your pup and have to try and come back and find it again. And so for the females, it makes sense for them to just stay with the pup, fatten up the pup as much as she can, and then at that point, basically the mom and pup go their separate ways. From the males, again, the males at this point, they're interested in mating with as many females as possible. So if all the females are hanging out in one spot, that's really where the males are going to be as well, because they want to maximize their chance of mating and reproducing. And so they're sort of hanging out there as well, waiting for their opportunities. So the second part of that question was, is it safer? And it's probably safer for the pups if the mom is close by. Because again, if you're a pup that's only 6 or 7 days old and you get separated from your mom, you're not going to survive. So there's another species of seal called hooded seals, and they are found much further north from Seal Island, and they have their pups on the ice in March, I believe, and they have the fastest lactation period of all seals, I think actually of all mammals, and their average lactation period is 4 days because the habitat is so unstable. So the moms spend 4 days with the pup, nursing the pup and fattening them up, and then they're weaned. And that's for sure a strategy that in that habitat works, because you don't want to get separated from your pup. You probably won't find them again in a really unstable environment. What is the next question? Why did you decide to study gray seals versus other kinds of seals? So I have been involved in other seal projects. I lived in the West Coast for a while, and I did some harbor seal work out there, and I've worked on harbor seals here in New England as well. What I really like about the gray seals, which I find really interesting, is they are a great conservation story. And so from that standpoint, from larger sort of ecological questions, they're great. We know that they went locally extinct in the Northeast U.S. during the 1900s, and then they sorry, let me fix my computer there. And then they were able to recover, and then we now find them pupping on 4 sites, 3 in Maine and then 1 on Muskeget Island, which is down in Nantucket Sound. And so it's interesting to see a population that was able to recover and think about what factors were important from a conservation standpoint. What was special about this population that allowed it to recover. And we think that there were several things going on. We know that there was a large source population in Canada that basically provided immigrants back into the U.S. We know that they can travel long distance easily. They have the ability to reproduce at a relatively young age for mammals. Again, the females can start having their pups at 4. They can live into their 30s and 40s, so you figure females that are having a pup a year and living to that age, so they can sort of build up their population quickly. And then the other thing that was really interesting is that in a lot of ways habitat has opened up for gray seals. So Seal Island, for example, where this camera system is set up, we know that historically there were fish camps on Seal Island where fishermen returning from being far out at sea would drop off catches to be dried and then brought further inland before the advent of all of our really fast ships and large engines. And then the Navy actually used Seal Island for quite some time as a bombing target, and that's all stopped. Likewise, Muskeget, which is the pupping site down near Nantucket, We know that there was a lot more human activity there, say 100 years ago. Around 1900, there were 20 plus hunting cabins, and people were out there hunting and fishing all winter long. And really, human activity patterns on a lot of these outer islands have changed. That's likely allowed the gray seals to recover in this part of their range. Um, so I think that's that question. They seem to like the grassy area. Do you know why they prefer this to the rocks? I do not know why they prefer this to the rocks. It's probably a little bit further away from the intertidal area, so we know that moms and pups don't want to be really close to where the intertidal is because they don't want the pups to get washed off. And let's see, the other thing I brought with me today that I'll see if I can show to you all, I know there's been a lot of questions about where they go and where are they eating and all that type of stuff, and we're trying to figure a lot of that out, and we do that by marking individuals and also by tagging individuals. And so some of you may have seen earlier that we've seen a branded seal on Seal Island this season that probably was born on Sable Island off Nova Scotia. So you can brand seals where you actually make permanent markings in their back. We also do things like attach flipper tags. I'll try and hold this up so people can see them. And they're basically, we use the same thing as farmers use on their cattle. And so you see it's just sort of like a big earring, and we just can put these right on their hind tag, and then between numbers, and sometimes you'll put other letters or phone numbers or combinations of numbers and colors and things, we can identify individuals that way. In some parts of the range, actually, things like these little hats are used. Obviously, if you have a flipper tag, and we put these on the hind flippers, when the seals are in the water, you can't see the flipper tag. So you can only see this when a seal is hauled out on land. These little hats are kind of nifty because if a seal is in the water, you can still see the number. We kind of glue it right on the top there. The flipper tags can stay on sometimes for years. The hats will only stay on until the seal molts. So seals molt every year, which is basically just like birds losing their feathers and growing in their new ones. Seals molt their fur, and so this does not stay on for a long time. I mentioned satellite tags. I do not have a satellite tag today because those are very expensive, and I would not just have one of those hanging out with me, but I do have several radio tags. This is a radio tag that we used a couple of years ago that actually could be attached to the hind flipper. And so here you see the antenna, and again, the seal needs to be out of the water, and what we've done is with radio tags, you have to go out and re-find the seal. There are other kinds that there's another example that can basically be glued onto the fur on the back of the seal. And again, the antenna sends out a signal, and we go up in planes and we fly around with a radio receiver and antennas on the planes, and we try to relocate the animals. And so this is a pretty labor-intensive way of figuring out where seals are moving and what they're doing. And so satellite tags now are really a great technology to try to figure out movements. Excuse me, but it's a lot more expensive. But with satellite tags, you can attach that to a seal. And again, it will keep track of a lot of data. And when the seal surfaces, it will send information about position, location, how much time was spent diving, how deep the seal was diving, how much time it spent hauling out. And it will send that all up to a satellite and then send that down to the scientist's computer. And so that's a great way to really start to understand what these seals are doing. There was a large-scale tagging effort in the spring, and we're having some information come in now of gray seals down on Cape Cod, and so we're hopefully starting to get a window into some of that data. All right, what other questions do we have? Do they crossbreed with other seal species? And if so, do the birthing times change? So no. So little biology here. So what makes a species? So a group of animals or organisms is considered one species if they can interbreed and they can produce fertile young. And so gray seals are only mating with gray seals right now in Maine. The other really common seal species that you'd see in Maine is harbor seals. Again, they're different species. They're not going to interbreed for a variety of reasons. One of them, which this question pointed out, is birthing time. So gray seals are having their pups and mating now. Harbor seals have their pups in May, and so they're having their pups in May and June, and they're mating then. And so we do not see hybridization. Every once in a while you might see some sort of hybrid seal, but it's unlikely that that will go on to have more pups. Do I know how fast a seal can move over land? Fast is all I can tell you. They can definitely move as fast as we can, in my personal experience. And so you want to stay out of the way of males that are looking either to entangle with another male or get to a female. They're pretty fast on land, considering they're not really adapted to it. So I don't have sort of miles per hour, but they can definitely move as fast as we can on land. So another question about what are the most threatened seal species worldwide. So some of the most threatened seal species are the monk seals. We know from an evolutionary standpoint they're sort of the oldest seals. So there are Hawaiian monk seals that are found on the outer islands in Hawaii. There's a Mediterranean monk seal, and then there was a Caribbean monk seal, but that has gone extinct. And there's a couple of different theories, probably just some combination of evolution coupled with human activity and hunting and things like that. And so that is probably what's happening with the monk seals. And then other species of seals and sea lions, some are endangered and we don't understand why. There are things like the stellar sea lions in Alaska. And there's a lot of work being done trying to figure out what's going on with those populations. And it depends on the species. Some are doing okay and others are not. So I have a list of other questions here. And so there's a question about how much milk does a baby seal drink. I don't know specifically how much the babies drink, but we do know that they can gain up to 2 pounds a day during that 16 to 20 day nursing period. So they're definitely drinking a lot of milk. Again, there have been lots of questions about the purpose of the lanugo fur, which is the white fur that the pups are born with. And that's, again, in part related to the fact that gray seals are ice breeders in some part of their range, and historically they probably were all ice breeders, meaning they had their pups on ice. And so that is why they're born that way. Trying to see what some of my other questions are. There's a question about how much a baby seal weighs when it's born versus when it's weaned. So pups can weigh between about 25 to 40 pounds when they're born. And when they're weaned, they can be anywhere from 80 to over 100 pounds when they're weaned. And so they can gain a fair amount of weight in that short time period, in that 2.5 to 3 week time period. And so again, the whole purpose, or what the moms are trying to do in nursing them so intensely, is to fatten those pups up as much as they can, because again, once the mom weans the pup, that pup is on its own. The mom does not teach the pup how to find fish. And so what we see is sort of groups of molted pups that are hanging out on the beach, and they live off their fat for a while, and eventually they get a little bit hungry and they head into the ocean on their own, and they try to figure out how to how to find fish. And so the fatter you are as a pup, again, all that fat is stored energy, and so the fatter you are, the more stored energy you have, the better your chance of survival is. It's just a bigger buffer in terms of time for you to figure out how to eat fish on your own. And so the more fat you have, the more time you can live off that fat, and the longer you have to sort of figure out how the whole world works. And so that's why we see these pups. That's why the moms are nursing them so intently. And then they sort of go in on their own. Another question, the general characteristics of pinnipeds. So pinniped means winged foot, is what the Latin translates as, and pinnipeds include the true seals, which are things like gray seals and harbor seals, the sea lions, which are what we see usually in zoos. The sea lions have larger foreflippers. They can sort of get up on them. They have ear flaps, and then also the walruses. And so Those are all pinnipeds, so they're obviously all mammals, they're all carnivores. They all have, again, these sort of what they call winged feet, because they have flippers now, not feet. They've adapted to live most of their life in the water. Um, they all return to land or ice to breed, though, and so they sort of have this dual lifestyle where they spend a lot of time at sea, but they do all return to give birth and to nurse their pups and to molt their fur. And so that is what a pinniped is. Um, Another question, how did seals evolve? They used to live on land, correct. Why did they decide to go into the ocean? That's a great question. So yes, they are evolved from land mammals. Why did they decide to go into the ocean? So, evolution is obviously, it's a little bit of a longer process, but probably these were land mammals that spent more and more time um, at the water's edge and spending time fishing in the water. And over time, they evolved to become more and more adapted to life in the water. And so evolution is a very slow process, but we know that, yes, they did come from land mammals. How long can a gray seal hold its breath for? That's a great question. I do not know specifically how long. Fair amount. Again, they can dive fairly deep, and so hopefully we can get some more specific facts on the Seal Island webcam site for you guys. What is the difference in weight for a male seal versus a female seal? So gray seals are what we call sexually dimorphic, and that means basically that males and females look different. And again, this is all part of their whole evolution of mating. So males are, as probably most of you have seen, the males can be significantly larger than the females. Fully grown adult male can be maybe 900 pounds. An adult female would probably be around 500 pounds. You'll notice that the males also have what is often called a horse head. And so their heads have this really just sort of solid snout, and they look like horses. They've actually been referred to on Nantucket for a long time, hundreds of years, as Nantucket's horse heads because of that really dominant face. The females don't have that same structure to their skull, so that's an easy way to pick out males and females once they're mature. We also know that males in general, their coat color tends to be darker. They tend to be sort of a darker gray, whereas females tend to be a lighter gray. Females can also sometimes look brown, so there's definitely variation, but as a rule of thumb, we see that adult males tend to look darker than females. So those are some of the differences between the males and females. Are the spots we see on the seal coats unchanging, or do they change when they molt? Can you identify a seal by its spots? That's great. A great question. There's been some research into this as well. No, we believe that the patterns that you see, again, not the patterns on the pups with the white coat, but a pattern you might see on a mom this year, that would hold true until next year. And there has been some work done on using coat pattern to try to use that to identify individuals. That potentially this is another way to keep track of individuals. We're always, as scientists, interested in knowing what's happening with the population, and one way to do that is to know how many individuals are surviving from year to year, how old they are when they have their pups. And so if we can look at an animal and say, oh, she was here last year and had a pup, and now she's back, we know she's survived, we know she's having pups. There's been software that's in development as well, to try to compare pictures and see if you can, sort of like facial recognition software for seals. There's still some work being done in terms of tweaking that, but seeing if that's a technology that could be used. If you get a good picture in the same angle and same spot of an individual, could you use that to identify them from one year to the next? So that's a great question that people are trying to figure out now. Do seals drink salt water? No, I do not believe they drink salt water. They get their hydration from what they're eating. Why do seals spend time in the deep puddles? We've noticed this on the cam when we watch. That's another great question. And so what we think they might be doing is actually cooling off. In parts of the UK in particular, so in parts of Scotland where there's large gray seal pupping sites, they actually have their pups in October there, and there's been a lot of research done there. They're on these sort of rocky outcroppings. It looks similar to seal, but they have a lot of little ponds and puddles, and they've noticed that basically the seals want to be close to those little ponds or puddles, and they think it's to cool off. Remember that it looks freezing cold out there to us, but they are large animals with these huge layers of blubber, and so if you're out on an island in October, it might be pretty warm, and so we know that they one way to cool off is to actually get wet. That helps, you know, people cool off just like we do. And so my guess is that what you may have been seeing was a seal maybe trying to cool off on, you know, a particularly sunny day. Again, in the UK, there's been a lot of work done, and they've looked at sort of habitat quality and things like that. And it appears on those sites that those puddles are really important, and that seals want to be near them. Let's see, what is our next question? How do baby seals learn how to hunt fish? Is it all instinct? How do they know how to navigate or return to Seal Island? So these are really great questions. So they teach themselves. It is instinct. Again, once the mom has weaned the pup, that's it. She does not teach the pup how to hunt. Excuse me. And so they basically, again, that's why, you know, the moms want to get them as fat as possible so they can live off that layer of blubber while they figure it out. But they go into the water on their own, and they just have to figure it out. So it is instinct, and that's probably partially why we see that survival is not 90 or 100% in the first year, because there's a lot of pups that are just trying to figure out how to fish. How do they know how to navigate or return to Seal Island? And that we don't know about either. We don't know what mechanism sort of locks that in, whether there's something, you know, what cues they're picking up on that allows them to sort of imprint on that island and figure out how to come back. That we don't know. There's probably a lot of different variables in nature that they're picking up on that they're using to navigate. And again, I think I mentioned before that most seals, just like most seabirds, tend to return to the island where they were born when it's time to have their pups, and so, or to mate if they're a male. And so there's this strong tie to where you're born, to the natal site. And so we know that most of these seals will likely come back to Seal Island when they're old enough to reproduce. And one of the questions that I find really interesting is not only how do those seals know how to go back to where they were born, but then also how do that subgroup of seals end up not going back to the Canadian site and coming down and establishing a new pupping site on Seal Island or Muskeget? What mechanism is switched that allows that to happen? I think that's a really interesting question, something that I've been interested in for years, as I think it's also an interesting question from a conservation standpoint. What's the quality of the individuals that leave those natal sites and go to new sites? Are they the peripheral animals that are having a hard time surviving in their sort of home territory, or are they the really strong ones that set out in search of new areas? And that's something that I think would be a really interesting question to answer. Do you know what regular body temperature is of a seal? I do not know what the regular body temperature is of a seal, but that is something we can also look into excuse me, and try to post on the website for you. A couple more questions that I got earlier. Do seals stick with a particular pod or group when they go out to the ocean, and how do they recognize members of their group? So they do not travel in sort of pods or groups the way that a lot of the whales do. When people think of something like orcas or killer whales that travel in these very established family groups, seals do not do that. We sort of see we can see general movements of animals from one area to the other. For example, on the Cape and Islands, what we see is gray seals use Muskeget Island, which is between Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard, for pupping. And then what we see is by mid to late February, they're all off of Muskeget. But then when it's time to molt in April, we see a huge gathering of gray seals on Monomoy Island, which is south of Chatham on Cape Cod. So we do see these general movements of species. Harbor seals, which is the other common species that we have here in New England, what we see is in the fall, there's seals, harbor seals are found from Maine all along the Massachusetts coast into Long Island Sound. Most of those seals in the early spring end up going up to Maine to pup and mate, and they hang out there during the summer. And then again, we see a subgroup kind of return back south and west. But again, whether specific individuals are staying together that whole time, we don't know, but we do see sort of these large-scale general patterns of movement. But they're certainly not the social structure that you see in some of the other marine mammals. Are seals territorial in the ocean? Probably not. I don't believe that they are. Again, they're probably moving around a lot in the ocean and looking for fish. The ocean is such a fluid environment compared to land that in general it's hard to sort of hold territories in the ocean. And so I would say unlikely that they're acting very territorial in the ocean. Do seals spend a lot of time playing? What will they do? So that's a hard question to answer. As a scientist, I sort of steer clear of trying to put human activities or human emotions on these animals because they're not human. It's hard to say, are they playing? They probably spend time in what looks like playing or interacting with each other, but I'm not sure we can qualify that as playing in the sense that humans play, or something like a dog or something like that. I mean, these are wild animals, and so daily survival is a lot of work for them, and so they're probably spending most of their time either looking for food or hanging out on a ledge and resting and conserving energy to go back out and look for more food. With our next question, what can we expect to see in the next couple of weeks on the seal camp? When do I think all the seals will be gone for the season? So again, it's, let's see, January 14th. So I would say we may see a few more pups still being born at this point. But what you'll see is the number of seals on the island will continue to decline. You'll start seeing more of an accumulation of pups that are going through that molt, so where they're losing that white fur. And again, once the moms have weaned the pups, they leave. And so what you're going to see is this general shift of adult females off the island and then adult males off the island, and then at the end what we'll see probably in early to mid-February is just some straggler pups that are still there that haven't headed out to sea yet. So that is what I would anticipate seeing. By early to mid-February, I would say the whole event will be pretty well wrapped up. Do I have a sense? Do I know what senses seals rely on most? Smell, sight. Are they better with these senses than humans? I mean, again, I would say that probably is dependent on where they are. They're probably relying on different senses in the water than they are on land. So we know that on land they can probably, they're probably using things like sense of smell to sort of maybe notice predators or people coming into the area. Noises, obviously, they're listening for when they're hauled out as well. In terms of their eyesight underwater is probably better than ours, obviously, because they're hunting underwater. So I think it depends. Are there orcas nearby who hunt these seals? No, there are not. Is the main reason for juvenile mortality rate due to starvation from not figuring out how to catch the food or from lack of food supply? Excuse me. So, again, so there's different types of mortality. There's first-year mortality, so that's just from there can be some people, scientists document all different types of mortality. So there can be pre-weaning mortality, so those are pups that don't even make it to being weaned, and probably some of you have seen that unfortunately there probably are some dead pups out on Seal Island now. And then we go into first-year mortality, which is basically how many pups from being born survive to age 1. And then juvenile mortality. Juveniles are usually classified from age 1 until they're reproductively mature, so around 3 or 4. And so in terms of is that due to not being able to find food versus a lack of food supply? Again, things like food supply and food habits for this population, we don't have a lot of specific information on. For sure, the mortality rate is higher in general for younger seals because they have a harder time finding fish than an adult who's been doing it for a while does. And just in general, probably their survival instincts are not the same as a seal that's 10 or 20 years old. In terms of lack of food supply, and these seals right here, this population in a general sense is increasing, so food supply is probably not limiting it right now. Sorry, my screen is doing something funny while I'm talking to you here. Another question, how has climate change affected the gray seals, if any? So this is a great question that people are thinking about, how climate change might affect seals. And so, again, these are animals that in parts of their range pup on ice, and they're certainly adapted to cold environments. And so if temperatures change and things become warmer, what we might expect to see is that their range, the southern limit of their range will probably move more northward because they're not adapted to be in very warm climates. And so remember, with all that blubber and fur, it's actually, they could overheat. They're not going to do well in very warm areas. And so in a general sense, I think if we're talking about climate change and warming in this environment, I think we can expect to see that their southern limit will start to creep up more northernly. In areas where gray seals are pupping on ice, and they're relying on good ice conditions to have their pups, obviously as that ice melts or changes, that's going to impact their ability to use that habitat. So it can impact them in a couple of different ways. Let's see, can seals catch more than one fish in their mouth at once? I do not believe so, no. They are usually catching one fish at a time. And usually, sometimes they'll bite off chunks or they'll swallow it whole. And so I would not anticipate that seals could catch more than one fish at a time. And actually, that's one of the ways we actually figure out what they're eating is we can look at the fish bones that come out as they go to the bathroom. Well, they don't use bathrooms, but we can look at the seal poop, or what we call scat, and we can look for fish bones in there. And that's one way to start to recreate what they're eating. In particular, what we use are something called otoliths, which are fish ear bones. And fish ear bones are unique to each species. And there are some people who are just amazing at this. They can look at fish ear bones and know what species they are. And there are a lot of guides out there that can be used. And so you can look at that seal scat or poop and start to get a sense of what they might be eating. And so that's one way to recreate their diet. The problem is that if the seal doesn't eat the head of the fish, then we're not going to see those ear bones because they're not going to go through the digestive system. And again, if a seal's out at sea for several days eating, we're not going to be able to collect that scat. And so this is why figuring out all those great questions about what they're eating and where they're eating and how much time they're spending eating are really hard and labor intensive to answer, because we can look at scat, but that's really just whatever they ate right before they came up onto land. Some of the other tactics that people use, they can look at things like different types of chemicals. So they can look at something called fatty acids or stable isotopes, which basically you can use to look at longer trends in diet. But in order to do that type of work, you also need to have the fatty acids and stable isotope measurements of prey. And again, you need to know where they're going. So it's a really labor-intensive thing to figure out what seals are doing and where. And again, that changes from season to season, right? So we know they're not really eating right now. They'll probably eating a lot in February. They might move into a different area. And so this is something that we're working hard trying to to figure out, but it's an ongoing process. Another question about eating. Seals eat the entire fish? Question mark. They don't choke? Nope, they can eat the entire fish. Again, if they catch a really big fish, they might pull it apart, but they can eat an entire fish. Another question, there's a baby seal scratching its neck. Could it have fleas? I don't know that it has fleas per se, but they're probably certainly parasites and things that are out there on them. Again, they're living in the wild where there's all sorts of other critters in and around that have adapted to living on these animals. I'll look and see if there are any other questions that I have from earlier that were sent to me. Why do seals like lounging on exposed rocks during low tide? And so, this is a behavior we see outside of the pupping season usually. So the gray seals that we're looking at are obviously up high on Seal Island and they're staying there, but we do see them haul out on the intertidal, and probably it's sort of a safe place to rest. They can kind of hang out there for a while. They're safe from land predators because they're just on these areas that get washed over. And again, it's hard work being a wild animal and being out there trying to find enough food to survive. And so that's a time for them to just come up and rest and take a little break. Another question, do seals use any group hunting techniques? Not that we're aware of, no. Again, they don't have that social structure that we see in something like some of the whales and dolphins. Let's see, what else do we have? Will more females arrive on Seal Island this season was another question I have. So I sort of answered that before about what to expect. I mean, I would imagine there could be still a few females that show up and have pups, but we're probably reaching the end of the new pups being born at this point. What is my favorite part of doing seal field research? Being on a pupping site is just a really exciting place to be. As you can see on the camera, there's just a lot going on. There's a lot happening. There's seals. There's lots of interactions between the seals. Oh, sorry. There are birds around, and it's quite an event. I mean, this is sort of nature in action. There are puppets. It's literally life and death for some of those animals out there, and it's just really incredible to be able to witness that. We don't get to see a lot of that really in modern life. So it's really exciting. And I think, let me look and see if I have any more questions that I did not answer. Let's see. So last question, are there any rescue groups that help abandon or hurt seal pups? Yes, there are. And actually, if you tune in tomorrow, noon Eastern Time, 9 a.m. Pacific Time, there will be another live chat with Linda Dottie. She's the director of the Marine Mammals of Maine, which is a nonprofit group that responds to calls regarding seals, porpoises, and whales that are stranding along the Maine coast. And so I'm sure she'll have lots of really great information about what she's seen and what to do in those events. So thank you again for tuning in for another live chat, and it's been a lot of fun, and thank you to Explore for such a great live camera system that allows us all to see what's going on out there.